Hello everyone, I'm David Vaucher. Welcome to Return on Racing. Return on Racing is powered by Vaucher Analytics, which helps race drivers and race teams drive efficiencies off track so they can fuel success on track. Return on Racing is also brought to you by the Motorsport Sponsorship Accelerator, the most cutting edge resource out there for finding, maintaining, and growing long-term sponsorship relationships. Today, I want to talk about a topic that is both controversial and iconic in the world of motorsport. Let's talk about how tobacco engineered the economics of modern motorsport. Let's get started. Now, before I dive too deeply in the topic, I want to give a disclaimer that is perhaps obvious but nevertheless necessary. Vaucher Analytics in no way endorses smoking, cigarettes, or any tobacco products. The information presented in this podcast and the associated article on the Vaucher Analytics website is for purely educational purposes. With that said, tobacco use is widely recognized as a lethal habit and has, for all intents and purposes, disappeared from the visible marketing landscape. You'd be hard-pressed to remember the last time you saw a tobacco brand anywhere but behind a store counter. Yet racing fans will know it wasn't always this way. As destructive as the tobacco industry was and continues to be, there is no denying just how mightily their involvement shaped motorsports. Obviously, we could talk about liveries which have since become iconic, and it's shocking just how many names from a certain era are actually tobacco related. Marlboro, Gitane, John Player Special, Silk Cut, all tobacco brands, and that's only a handful of examples. So why did tobacco companies invest so heavily in motorsports? Well, they did so because the return on investment they received allowed them to quite literally engineer several eras of motorsports, and not just F1. Tobacco companies also defined the modern era of racing sponsorship, and they did so for reasons that still form the bedrock of why any brand enters the sport today. In marketing, the ground rule is to appeal to your target demographic, and decades ago, there was a nearly perfect overlap between motorsports and how tobacco companies wanted their brands perceived. So let's talk about first the cultural alignment between speed, danger, and masculinity. Tobacco brands, particularly in the post-war era, weren't just selling cigarettes. They were aiming for cultural relevance, and motorsport offered the perfect playground for this effort. Fast cars, brave men, global glamour, national prestige. Motorsport had it all, and it wasn't just advertising, it was myth-making. Marlboro, for instance, wasn't just promoting a product, it was selling identity. And the Marlboro Man, as imagined by the brand, probably did race cars. That made F1 and motorsport generally the perfect showcase for tobacco products. Let's start with a couple of reasons why, and first is global reach without regulation. Much earlier than you might suspect, as far back as the 1970s and 1980s, in fact, traditional media channels in key Western markets were increasingly closed and closing off to tobacco advertising. Regulatory pressure tightened, bans proliferated, but motorsport remained an open frontier via an intrinsic loophole. You see, ad breaks for tobacco products weren't allowed, but no ad breaks were needed in motorsport because the race itself was the ad, and racing series placed no limitations on liveries. And with global travel, international broadcasts, and fan bases that span continents, motorsports became one of the last legal avenues for tobacco giants to pump their brands into the public consciousness at scale. So you had this intrinsic loophole of no ad breaks being needed, and then you also had unparalleled branding real estate. Motorsport offered something no other sport could: total brand immersion. Full car liveries turned race cars into mobile billboards. Driver suits, helmets, and even team names became brand assets. You had Marlboro McLaren, Mild 7 Benetton, just to name a couple of examples. On-screen time during the race coincided with the very moment the product was metaphorically in use. The branding wasn't supplemental, it was embedded, and to this day, race fans will easily identify and adore the John Player Special Lotus F1 car. So let's talk about now the demographics that were receptive to this message. The motorsport fan base at the time was a marketer's dream for tobacco: young, male, impressionable, and statistically more likely to smoke. Furthermore, these were not passive viewers. As they do today, racing fans back then followed the sport with religious devotion, as much as they could with the media available at the time. They bought the merchandise, idolized the drivers, and connected the brand with the thrill of winning. For tobacco companies laser focused on cultivating brand loyalty, this was addiction by another name. And enabling all of this was the fact that tobacco companies could outspend everyone. Tobacco companies had significant profit margins, which gave them the power to outbid nearly every other industry. They locked in title sponsorships, funded full works teams, and even influenced regulatory decisions. Here's an extract from the NASCAR Way, the business that drives the sport. Quote, the following year, in 1972, R.J. Reynolds proposed a deal. It would sponsor NASCAR's top racing series if NASCAR would reduce the number of races from 46 to 31. Reynolds believed that a shorter tour, profiling bigger events, would create more meaningful exposure and a more cost-efficient use of its promotion dollars. NASCAR agreed to the proposal, and thereafter its premier race series was known as the Winston Cup. End quote. This wasn't sponsorship, it was acquisition. Companies didn't so much buy space in motorsport as own its aesthetic for decades, and no other sector could compete. So that was then. Rules have evolved, regulations have evolved, but let's talk about how tobacco sponsorship still influences the sponsorship and motorsport landscapes. The tobacco era left three long-lasting impacts that still define motorsports sponsorship. First, it set a precedent for big budgets. Tobacco normalized eight-figure annual deals, making them the gold standard. Second, it elevated livery to the level of iconography. Marlboro, Rothmans, JPS, these liveries remain timeless because of the saturation and storytelling from that era. And even the efforts to get around explicit tobacco branding became iconic. I'm thinking here of the Buzz and Hornets livery that the Jordan team used. And tobacco brands continued to find under-the-radar ways to sponsor motorsports into the 2020s. You should look up Mission Winnow that the Ferrari team was using if you're curious about that. Even if they won't openly admit it, it's hard to imagine any livery designer today not reaching for a design that's only fractionally as impactful as some of the tobacco-themed designs which are still remembered today, and very fondly. Third, it created a vacuum, a permanent hunt for the next vice. Alcohol, energy drinks, crypto, each has tried to fill the void tobacco left behind with mixed results, and I'll cover that in just a moment. In short, tobacco built the economic architecture of modern motorsports, and not because they loved racing, but because they could hack the system. They didn't sponsor the sport, they used it to the point where they could actually influence the rules. So, did tobacco go all in elsewhere? Not even close. While tobacco companies dabbled in other domains, no other sport or industry received the saturation level investment they poured into motorsport. Tobacco brands occasionally appeared on jerseys, but even then, when they were just one of many sponsors with no control over presentation or scheduling. Sports clubs, as community institutions, could never be branded the way a race team could. The Olympics were always too clean, and even in the 1980s, with looser regulation, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, made efforts to distance itself from tobacco money, and let's face it, the idea of associating cigarettes with physical excellence was already laughable. In American sports, the US began restricting tobacco advertising earlier than Europe, far earlier, in fact. MLB started banning sponsorship in the 1950s and 60s for tobacco products, and cigarette brands never got prime jersey real estate or naming rights. Stadium deals were rare, local, and lacked the global visibility tobacco craved. After all, baseball is the great American pastime. It did not have the global reach that motorsport had. As for fashion, film, and music, sure, there were placements. Actors and actresses smoked regularly in mid-century films, but these were passive, fragmented, and ultimately unscalable channels. By contrast, motorsport offered not a billboard, but a canvas. Only in racing did tobacco go from being a sponsor to an architect of the sport itself. Motorsport was a branding dream, and tobacco capitalized on it like no other. As I was researching this piece, the question that came to mind next was it easier to be sponsored during the tobacco era? After all, if money was flowing, wouldn't it be easier for any driver at the time to get sponsorship? Well, yes and no. If you were in the right place with the right look at the right time, it was absolutely easier. But it was not an open book for everyone, or an open checkbook, to be more specific. Tobacco had money to burn. These companies operated with massive marketing budgets and a mindset focused on domination, not just ROI. They funded not just teams, but entire series, scholarships, and even circuits. If you were picked, you were set. Think Marlboro, Rothmans, Benson and Hedges, Camel, brands that became household names in large part due to their motorsport involvement. But this wasn't a free-for-all. tobacco sponsors were extremely picky. As any marketer would do today, they concentrated their money on top teams and highly visible brand aligned drivers. Many good drivers never got backing because they didn't fit the brand image. Tobacco companies wanted walking advertisements, drivers who looked the part, were media friendly, and ideally local heroes in key markets. The environment was also cutthroat. With tobacco monopolizing team sponsorships, other brands stayed away. This made the latter even harder for those outside the tobacco orbit. There was no robust second tier of sponsors, so if you didn't land a tobacco deal, your chances of making it were significantly lower. There were also conflict risks. Tobacco brands were exclusive, one brand per team per series. If Marlboro was always funding Ferrari, they weren't backing your lower tier campaign. So, yes, it was easier to get massive sponsorship, with the caveat if you were one of the chosen few. But for everyone else, it was actually harder than ever. Tobacco crowded out other industries, distorted team economics, and made access more stratified. The tobacco era was a golden parachute for the marketable and a closed shop for the rest. It wasn't meritocracy, it was marketing, plain and simple. If you fit the brand fantasy, they funded your fantasy. If not, tough luck, because the landscape for sponsorship was limited outside of that orbit. So those days are behind us now. Could any industry dominate the same way today? If you're a team or series operating in 2025, from a financial point of view only, you would probably love to repeat the cash flow of this time. Again, setting aside all of the health detriments of tobacco and tobacco related products. But the question isn't, how do we get another tobacco style sponsor? To that previous point, it's how do we offer that level of psychological leverage without the moral and physical baggage? Today, no current industry has both the capital and the shameless incentive alignment that tobacco had. But let's be more systematic. What made tobacco the ideal motorsport sponsor? We've already started to cover this, but let's recap 5 elements. First, they had massive margins and could spend freely. Second, they had an addictive product with high customer lifetime value. They also had intense regulatory pressure, driving them to whatever alternative market channels existed, and of course, encouraging them to double and triple down on those channels. They also had a male-dominated user base directly aligned with motorsports demographic, and they had strong visual identity and aspirational lifestyle positioning. So, who comes close today? Crypto, at its peak, had, and perhaps in some areas still has, massive budgets, a rebellious aesthetic, and a high-risk appetite. But now it's, we could say, a bit tainted with scandals and facing regulatory crackdowns, and crypto investments just don't have the broad reach of cigarettes. I mean, just being very cynical about this, everyone can smoke, but not everyone is necessarily going to look into investing in crypto. Online gambling and sports betting are another potential avenue. They have large margins, a constant need for new customers, and great demographic alignment. And again, cynically, because this is Vice, potentially high customer lifetime value. They operate globally and digitally, but they are heavily regulated and they're well exposed in other sports. Energy drinks are an interesting possibility, with Red Bull having set the template not just for marketing and energy drinks, but really for lifestyle branding. They offer that lifestyle branding, youth appeal, and a willingness to back niche and extreme sports. But it's not just motorsports. Red Bull is present in all kinds of extreme sports. Monster Energy is another example, but beyond that, it's hard to imagine anyone else making as much of an impact. There is Rich Energy. They were involved in F1. That did not end well, so let's set them aside. But remember, even keeping in mind Red Bull's dominance, we want to find examples where a category absolutely saturates an area of motorsports. And while energy drinks, via that one particular sponsor, and again, Monster Energy in a slightly lower second tier, they just don't have that presence. They are still not to the level of tobacco in its prime sponsorship days. So let's move a little bit away from what you'd call vice, but definitely discretionary spending. And we have luxury brands. So watches, fashion, high-end cars. You know what I'm talking about. They have motorsports heritage, they have high margins, and they have very strong aesthetics that's built into luxury. They'll invest heavily, as LVMH has done in F1, but it's hard to imagine luxury generally reaching the level of tobacco sponsorship, if only because mass market appeal is antithetical to the era of exclusivity that the luxury business aims to cultivate. Again, moving farther away from vice, Tech, AI, and enterprise software have deep pockets and strategic motives, and names like Oracle, Google, and now Atlassian are deeply entwined with F1. But will they get to the all encompassing level that tobacco reached? Probably not. So, what's the actual answer then? Can anyone replace tobacco in its heyday in motorsports? Well, there isn't really one to go to, and what you really would need is a portfolio strategy. So, betting in crypto where it's legal and feasible, energy drinks and luxury for lifestyle association, tech and software as a service for innovation driven B2B deals, and regional disruptors like telcos or perhaps EV startups for strategic plays. And who could be next? Well, cannabis brands, once federally legal, offer massive growth potential, big budgets, and a need to rehab their image to a certain extent. I know I'm speaking generally here, but the parallels between cannabis and tobacco, again, on a surface level, are somewhat obvious. I'll just leave it at that. Fintech and new types of banking also perhaps stand a chance. You can perhaps throw this under the tech grouping. They want mass mail engagement, they market aggressively, and they need a culturally relevant wedge. But all of these aside, so Vice and not so Vice, uh, they're not they're not tobacco. You're not going to get another Marlboro, but you can assemble a patchwork of Marlboro-like behavior across industries that share these key traits: high margins, hunger for attention, a willingness to provoke, and a deep understanding of identity-driven marketing. This can be highly beneficial in getting you through tough economic times because many of these businesses are counter-cyclical. A couple of things to mention though: you want to make sure that you are personally comfortable partnering with a certain industry and that existing sponsors don't object to bringing on additional sponsors from unconventional industries. So don't chase the next tobacco. Chase the next industry under pressure to grow irrationally fast because that's where your money will likely be. On that, I want to end today's episode of Return on Racing by thanking you all again for choosing to spend your time with me. If this was of interest to you, I invite you to please sign up for the Return on Racing newsletter. You can do this via the front page of the Vaucher Analytics website. That's www.vaucheranalytics.com. And this is the weekly newsletter from Vaucher Analytics covering actionable motorsport strategy, cost breakdowns, and sponsor intel, all in less than 500 words. So the idea is to get you regular insights you can put to use as efficiently and quickly as possible. Again, I want to thank you so much for spending your time with me here on Return on Racing, and I look forward to speaking with you on the next episode.